All right, good afternoon. My name is Jeff Tehovnik, and we're going to be presenting network security monitoring. So a little bit about me. I love network IDS, IPS administration, and engineering. I can't really tell you why. I just like the challenge. Here's my credentials. You can note that I graduated from VCU twice. I worked here, so this is a little bit of a home for me, and I probably know over 50% of you, so that's pretty awesome. I love ethical hacking. I'm a Python junkie, like everyone else probably here. Automation and virtualization, where I work at now, I kind of fell in love with it. Also, family guy, like movies, beach, contact sports, home improvement, and a little bit of woodworking and restoration. I'll be putting this presentation at the GitHub link, so if you want to just capture that, you can check out the presentation slides later. Okay. All right, the legal slide. The views expressed are my own and not of my employer or any organization I'm affiliated with, blah, blah, blah. All right, so experiences and lessons. We're going to go over a quick introduction for network security monitoring. Everyone here probably knows what that is or has heard of something about it. I'm going to give my background in NSM, some of the challenges and solutions that I've faced, solved, or have yet to solve, including architectures, as well as going into actually some tuning lessons, and then we'll just wrap it up. All right, so this quote I love because it encapsulates my experience, but also DevOps, because failing was a really bad word, and then someone came up with DevOps, and now failing is great. So network security monitoring, there's a definition off of Richard B's book. Most everyone who's in NSM in some form or other has heard of this book that he's written. So that's kind of like the source, if you will, just de facto, because it's been around for a while. It's easy to focus on network IDS like I do, or a single tool, but at the end of the day, you need to build your ecosystem to be effective. You can't rely on one thing. Security is kind of like ogres and onions. They have layers to them. And every organization is going to be unique. So Dan Holden gave a pretty good talk. I'll give a reference in a little bit here. But I talked to him, and I was talking to him about my presentation and my content, and he just boiled it down to 2 words. So if you take anything away from here, just remember, you got to get scope and coverage right. That's probably the most critical thing. Otherwise, the rest is pretty much details. So network intrusion detection systems, for those that may not know, that's a system that monitors and inspects the network traffic. It's looking for signatures. These signatures can be behavioral, or they could be a pattern match. When it creates the alerts, matches the traffic and creates an alert, it'll then send it to a logging system. SIM may alert via email, so send out email, a whole bunch of different methods. Your SOC has to be able to respond to the alerts in a timely fashion in order to be effective. Otherwise, you're pretty much performing recovery. And you also have to maintain and update your signature database. Also a PCI requirement. There's a network intrusion prevention system. Now this system sits in line with network traffic. And obviously it's called prevention system because it's meant to prevent attacks. The key here is to get a correct configuration, because you don't want to end up dropping traffic that isn't malicious. It's actually legitimate. And you also still need your incident response. So a common misnomer used to be you buy a network IPS system and, hey, we're good. We prevent all our attacks, right? Well, everyone here knows that's not the case, that you may stop one attack, but there's 10 others coming your way. So, IPS is great to stop that initial attack, kind of stop the script kiddie stuff, but a determined attacker is still going to get through. So you still need your incident response to ensure that you're still protected and to catch anything that does get through. So again, IDS, you have a low risk of network disruption. If your tap fails or something like that, you might have something at risk, but generally, network engineers prefer that method. You have lower resource requirements on your actual IDS device versus an IPS device, but you do have higher resource requirements on your network gear if you're doing a span port. Now, again, another case for tap. We'll look at that in a little bit. But you have easier implementation. Maintenance is easier as well. And for false positives, it's really not so critical. So if you're really low on resources or really just need to get going right away, just do IDS and don't worry about the false positives, because your analyst will hate you, but your network guys will just be like, hey, that's great. We don't have to worry about blocking legitimate traffic. And again, IPS, network configuration has to be right. It is resource intensive on the device itself. And you do need higher maintenance because you do have to spend the time and effort to do the tuning. You do have risk to network connectivity if you fail to configure it correctly. And so, again, network guys are really adamant. The network's got to stay up. All right, so diagram. I tried to include some pictures, so you guys can look them up later. This picture, this diagram in particular, is actually pretty not correct on the tap side. Does someone see maybe an improvement they can make right off the bat? Oh, okay, I'll give you a hint. It's got the word span on it. Okay, so where the span port is on the router. I would actually probably move that to below the firewall, and I'll discuss why in a little while. On the right, that diagram is of a span on a switch port. Span stands for switch port analyzer, and as you can see in the diagram, it's pretty basic. Just copies traffic and sends it out an interface. So tap or span, which one do I go with? Well, you really have to look at some factors like how much cost can you afford, not only monetarily, but also your engineering resources. Do you have network engineers that can throw their time and efforts at this? What kind of design do you want? Do you want a simple passive fiber tap where you basically take a fiber, plug it in, and go? Or do you want something kind of more managed tap-wise, where you slice and dice the traffic that you're sending to your IDS and other appliances as well? You can do things like a filter, and even the newer taps, they can do all kinds of things like SSL inspection and deep packet inspection, like that. You can also do multiple taps into one feed. So it's easy to think of a one tap, but think of a tap fabric, if you will. So if your organization has network connectivity spread out across the globe, there's ways to bring it all back to a central point. Now, span ports, you don't need additional money invested as far as buying additional network gear, because most network gear today has span capabilities. But again, you got to check out what your network device capabilities are. And we'll discuss kind of the relationship between network engineers and security engineers. But to me, it's critical. And it works well with me because I have a lot of respect for network engineers. I think they do some pretty amazing things. They work with some amazing technology. So hats off to network engineers. And they make my job easier in most cases. But some of the newer switch models do some pretty cool stuff. R spans, ER spans, we'll talk about those. The problem on the monitoring side is you might lose a span port and not know it, because a lot of times a network team is in charge of the network gear and security team is in charge of security gear, and it's just a feed, and if it dries up and you don't have an alert, you won't get any traffic. And you won't know about it, and come to find out, a network engineer changed your configuration. So you got to check on that. And also, I mentioned the resource utilizations on the switches. Everyone's favorite. So trying to be vendor agnostic. So this is the only slide I will present vendors. This is not a complete list, but we'll go over the open source options. Zeek, which most people know as Bro. I like Troy's talk. I gave it RVAsec 5. He gave a really nice presentation. So definitely check that out if you're looking at an open source tool. You have Snort and Suricata, and Security Onion, which is an actually distribution that wraps up the 3 previous tools and even some more tools up nicely, so it's easily deployed. Vendors, there's a list there. It's a very incomplete list, but there's kind of a starting point to get checked out. And if you're interested, check out the Dan Holden speech with Elizabeth Martin they gave at RVAsec 3. They do mention the 5-year cycle, and so it's been about 5 years. So a lot of things that they talked about have cycled through and over, but they've also kind of hit the nail on the head with probably the last 10 to 15 minutes, I'd say, of their presentation. So some open source considerations are, it is less expensive. It's open source, right? It's also flexible because it is open source. Everyone knows the advantages of open source. The things to consider, you do need to purchase, or I highly recommend purchasing high performance NICs. I've had really good luck with Miracom. I think they got bought out by CSPI. There's also Endace, SolarFlare, and I've also used Napatech in the past with good success. The cool thing that I also have seen or done is just take a decommissioned server or servers and throw them into a cluster. I kind of like rebuilding things or getting my hands on technology. So I always see organizations, they decom something and it goes to the scrap pile or whatever. Nothing wrong with taking that and using it and getting some more use out of that. And the cluster, it's nice too, because if it dies, it's clustered. There's a lot of support for the open source community. Security Onion has a very active feed and mailing list. There's actually people dedicated to responding to inquiries in that community. And there's also professional services available for open source tools. Security Onion Solutions is actually born out of the Security Onion distribution. Doug Burks runs it. He's a great guy. There's also VARs. Here's a couple listed here, but everyone's probably already got a VAR, so you can work with your VAR to get started. And open source is kind of a trade-off between monetary and your time and energy and effort to expend. So if you have a team of 4 folks, you might be good at open source, but if you've got to get somebody to do it and just get it done, you might want to pay the additional cost for a vendor. Also, we talked about investments. There are additional options, I think, on the vendor appliances. They seem to have some additional bells and whistles that aren't standard for Network IDS, but are pretty nice to have in the security realm. And they have service and support, and you always get a sales rep and engineer, so everyone likes to eat, right? So there's a bonus there with your sales rep. And they do focus on IPS because it's really salesy and catchy to say, our product's an IPS, we stop traffic. But just be aware that your vendor may support IDS as well. So if you're not ready to throw it in line and just start blocking traffic, you can go ahead and put it in IDS mode and then flip the switch later. Beyond IDS IPS, again, I talked about the ecosystem. You have your host-based IDS IPS, log forwarding, log correlation, storage, analysis, which is generally required by your governance, risk, and compliance, your forensics, your incident response, packet captures, talk about that. A nice one, you have Moloch, Packet Sled, and NetSniff NG. You have forensics that you have to support, and SIM integration, which is pretty crucial for network security monitoring. All right, so now the more better stuff, in my opinion. So my background, actually before this, was starting 2004. I was a professional firefighter to 2014. I earned my master's degree, came out to work here at VCU, and started working on Security Onion. And kind of fell in love with it, kept going on to lead the Network IDS, IPS, architecture, and started with a CSP in 2015. And 2017 took over the whole IDS IPS. We have about 30-something devices deployed around the globe. And 2019, actually need to update the first slide because recently my boss left, so they made me interim manager. So I haven't been in the training yet, so I haven't had the probes to remove all the technical knowledge, so we're still good on this talk. I think I'm not supposed to say that. That's probably in the manager training. Some challenges I faced as an IDS administrator. Some network engineers are confrontational. They really pride themselves on keeping the availability of the network, right? So part of that CIA triad, the network's got to be available, because if the network goes down, they don't hear the end of it. Some budget constraints. I think all organizations face these in one form or another. Scalability. As a cloud service provider, you have to be able to grow fast. And administration, just the usual. Everyone faces backups, central management, logging, reporting, all the fun stuff. So some of the solutions I've designed and implemented, I'll go in these in detail. But the first one was pretty cool. It was a really large security onion server. I'm a technologist, and this thing was awesome. I mean, talking about a terabyte of RAM, 5 years ago. It's just, had a great GUI, by the way. But that was that. The scaled solution, which worked out even better. The vendor solution that had to scale, and then also, I'll go into the LBL architecture, but I was able to apply that after learning about it and actually meeting the guys that developed it, which is pretty cool. All right, so architectures. Anyone recognize this structure? Yeah, New York City. The shipyard, I think. Yeah. So that's a pretty cool staircase. So this is kind of the basic architecture of Network IDS, at least how I think of it. Internet, router, firewall, Network IDS, IPS, then switch, and then devices. So I actually had another student ask me one time, well, why do you put it behind the firewall? Why not the router? Or, why not the switch? Can anyone answer why it's not here right below the router but before the firewall? Exactly. So you want your devices, you want the router to take the first hit because it's layer 3 and it's making simple IP comparisons. So you definitely don't want it above your router. Below your router, you might be monitoring a threat that's actually dropped by your firewall. And you're also using additional resources to do that. Whereas your IDS IPS device, you actually want to use less resources. So you're actually monitoring true traffic. And if you go below the switch, then you run into, well, now you're monitoring one segment, but you may not be monitoring another, vice versa. So this is how I think of it initially, because you get attacked from the internet, but we're missing something. Anyone know what we're missing? You are missing east-west, but even bigger than that. Okay, I'm missing my malware callbacks. But the great thing about it is I don't have to change my architecture to monitor that. So when you're looking at your logs and you see source and destination IP and it looks reversed, just remember you're monitoring for both. So if you see an attack and the source and destination IP are switched, start thinking malware callbacks, or even you might have an attacker on your network attacking another network. So bi-directional, Ingress and Egress for the network folks. All right, the one big server. So it was very easy to administer. It's one big server. It was easy to back up, easy to set up. The architecture was, there it is. It's one server. The budget request was 2 line items. It was the server and the storage. And the data center footprint was very small. And if you wanted to, you could virtualize it. The problem with virtualization is you take about a 20% performance hit. And that's just kind of metrics that we gained after doing a little bit of research at my workplace. But obviously that number will fluctuate, but expect about 20% hit for virtualization. Some of the disadvantages, it's inefficient on its resource utilization. You have to really know what you're doing on a system. I'm not a great system administrator. I can get around. But when you get into things like CPU pinning, that's above me. I can read it, but I can't really apply it. Also, your interfaces, they can get saturated if it's on one server. If you're clustered, you kind of have that balance scheme so you don't get saturated. But if everything's going to one spot and you peak your traffic, you may end up dropping packets and losing visibility. And also, you're a single point of failure. If you're in IDS mode, maybe you don't care so much. If you're in IPS mode, you're going to get a call from network guys. And you can't really repurpose older hardware because you generally don't have a 1 terabyte server or 1 terabyte of RAM in a server lying around. If you do, great. By all means, go for it. But it's just not something I would see. So my lessons that I learned, as I said, you need a seasoned system administrator to tune it. You can do multiple network interface cards and set up flows and hashing that way. And I mentioned monitoring outbound traffic, but you also want to monitor for other things, like data loss, files, etc. All right, so next challenge was security onion with ER spans. I did not set this up initially. I kind of came into it. Again, somebody resigned, and I kind of took over for them. So it was great because it's very flexible, agile, all the stuff people like, virtualization. You can have a backup IDS so you don't lose monitoring if your primary goes down for maintenance or has an issue, and you have a backup ready to rock. Disadvantages, I had no idea what ER span was. It was above me, so I had to check it out. I didn't really have any network folks to help me out, so I finally figured out what it was, and it's pretty cool. But again, keep that relationship with the network engineers tight because you'll need their help. And you also have to be on supported hardware. Not all network gear supports ER spans. It is becoming very prevalent, but a couple years ago it wasn't quite so much. And you're also relying on span ports. I think we talked a little bit about that. We'll talk about that a little bit more. All right, so some of the lessons. It's pretty lucrative because you can sniff anywhere in the network and have a single monitoring point. It's pretty nice. Your network appliances, though, they do take the hit from the span port, and your configuration management and version control of your network gear can really help out with trying to ensure that span port stays operational. And the simplest thing, I try to break things down so I can remember them. If you're doing L2 connectivity, you can do an R span. If you're doing L3 connectivity, do an ER span. And the E stands for encapsulated, so encapsulated remote switch port analyzer. Took me all night to remember that. All right, now one of my favorites, because I actually met the folks that developed it, is the Lawrence Berkeley Labs design. They published a paper. The link is here. It's a great paper. It's super technical, so if you want to eke out, check it out. It's really useful. Gives you a lot of great advice, whether you use their architecture or not on doing Network IDS. But essentially, they're doing optical taps to an aggregation switch to their cluster. It's a Bro cluster. It scales. They're doing 100G monitoring. They've got two switches, 7504 from Arista, and then a 7154 from Arista. It's very easy to scale, easy to manage traffic, and you can actually modify it pretty easily to fit your organization's needs. Where I was, we actually used Suricata instead of Bro because it kind of met our requirements a little bit better at the time. All right, so The problem that we hit, or at least I did, was we were getting a lot of encrypted traffic. And so we weren't really seeing what we wanted to see. We're seeing a whole lot of NTP traffic, but also we were monitoring VPN traffic, after it was encrypted. So it wasn't quite as beneficial, but it did meet a compliance requirement, so we kept it around. Our network teams, they love the optical taps. They're pretty much maintenance free. There's no moving parts, and the only downtime is the implementation. Otherwise, it's an optical tap. You know, you're splitting light. I think the easy way to remember it, or if you got to explain optical taps and how it works to management, the easiest way is to say, I have a flashlight and there's a tree outside, so I shine the light through the window at the tree. So the light still, you know, hits the tree, but I can see it in the window. So you're splitting light. There's a Gigamon paper I referenced too that actually explains things like light loss and how to make sure that you don't hit any issues. But for the most part, it's plug it in and whatever the network guys do, they do. The Arista switches, I fell in love with these. Again, I'm not a network guy, so I found them very easy to use. I know there's other switches out there that people like, but I personally just like these because of the full bash implementation. Every interface is available in a bash CLI. Tap aggregation is pretty nice. You can slice and dice your traffic however you need to. And for management, there's a pretty GUI available that looks like that. So, all right, so now we get into our proprietary appliance or vendor appliance. So I inherited this architecture, transitioning from a span setup. They're actually going inline because the device was more efficient at doing inline monitoring versus span sniffing. I admit my first impression was kind of blah. I wasn't too impressed when I first started. But I found that the bells and whistles, I was like, I don't need this stuff. I just want to do IDS and IPS. Various devices that I inherited were in different states. Some of them working, some weren't. Some were named differently. It's kind of bad, but switching costs, I think we're all in this boat. If you have NSM, the switching costs just prohibit you from switching. And when I heard the term Unified Threat Management, I thought it was just a sales term. But since then, I do like the fact that the inline configurations do allow IPS. You can do IPS on certain network segments to start out with. They use VLAN configurations. Again, I'm not a network engineer, but this is pretty cool. I thought this was kind of magic when I saw it, but network engineers are just like blah. Or you could do true inline where you plug one wire in one interface and plug another in the other, and it goes to the device itself. So lots of options. I started looking at Unified Threat Management a lot better and a lot more, and I decided that I may not use the blocking capabilities, but the logging features were pretty impressive. I could get all kinds of logs based on my appliance, so I turned it into Unified Threat Logging versus Unified Threat Prevention. So things like application level blocking, I just wanted to put in monitor mode because I didn't want to deal with the fallout of blocking something somebody used, like maybe Facebook. So it's like Bro, but different. And it's different because the logging is different, but otherwise you get very similar information. So I learned to leverage my position with the vendors to get trainings, certification, and food. I do suggest that you still do a bake-off, not only before or right before or when you're ready to buy an appliance for the first time, but continue to assess where you're at. You know, if you have another vendor that offers you a bake-off, you know, check it out, get some ideas, and just affirm that either you have the right appliance, or maybe you want to look at switching. But it's always good to know what's out there. Interior devices are right-sized. Also applies to open source solutions as well. You're looking at bandwidth, device processing, your interfaces. So it's a little bit harder to find open source SFP interfaces, but it's a little bit easier if you buy a vendor appliance. They just support them out of the box. Your dashboard reporting, all the fun stuff. Central management and backups, don't forget that as well. So now we're into the next generation. This is the fun part of working for a CISSP, software-defined data center. So is anyone in here running an SDDC? Like a VMware NSX environment type thing? Okay. I'll spend some more time on this then, because I really like it. So your distributed firewall, and everything is virtualized in the software-defined data center. So even your network, your switches, edge services, gateways, firewall, everything's virtualized, which is nice because you have what's called a distributed firewall where you apply the rules centrally and you can put them everywhere. So it makes configuration management and version control pretty easy. Also, your network devices, you can repeatedly deploy them in different configurations. You're not physically racking and stacking them, aside from the first run, to get them in place. That's your top of rack switches, but that's a little bit different. Your API is the key here. So everyone in security, from what I've seen, likes Python, except for those who like Perl. There's still a few of y'all. But both work really well with the APIs. And so the software-defined data center it just mixes with the APIs real well. So you can do your own automation, roll your own. It's very easy to do. Your integrations with third-party happen via something that they call NetX. So it's very seamless. It works with their APIs and their software. And your network IDS and IPS functionality is actually achieved through something called service chaining. So think of your virtual machine. The service chaining actually looks at your VM down to the NIC level and applies traffic rules right before it hits the NIC. And you do have an alternative option. If you don't want to do IDS and IPS and service chaining, you can actually do a tap, virtual tap, that does service chaining as well, but just does it in tap mode. So you would, at that point, dump your traffic to wherever your VM resides. It could reside anywhere in that data center. So pretty similar to a physical tap. And don't forget ER spans that I had to figure out what they are. They are supported in NSX. So another option, again, check with your network engineers to make sure that their switches don't die if you enable it. So some advantages, talk about it's flexible. You can define your network IDS deployment down to the VNIC level. You can define it by switch. The advice that I've gotten mostly from some of the seasoned veterans is to use security tags. So use security tags if you can. It's automatic HA, already integrated. It's very scalable, and it solves the east to west traffic monitoring issue that was mentioned because it works on the VNIC. So not only does it go north to south, it goes east-west. Disadvantages, no fully open source solution yet. I think that's only a matter of time. Maybe a next presentation or something, but we'll see. It does require specialized knowledge, so you do have that next level expert that needs to be involved. And you can't utilize the service chaining functionality on the switch interfaces. So it's nice to monitor the VMs, but if you say, I want to monitor all traffic on this switch, it's on the VM level. It's not actually at the switch because the switch runs in the hypervisor. Again, you can use ER-span probably to mitigate that. So what's the future of network IDS look like? So some things I've thought of, using a microservice to run IDS, IPS. through service chaining. Someone's probably already done that. I just haven't heard about it. I think that would be pretty easy to do. Anyone here running Kubernetes? That's where I would do this, the microservice. You might see forcing the IoT and SCADA community to go through a separate monitor point, pretty much specifically for IoT and SCADA. And something I'm looking forward to, I think it's already here, we haven't gone deep enough into it yet, is AI-fueled smart alerting. So I'm not sure how I feel about AI, but I really feel it could help out in the alerts. I think the flood of alerts can be lessened with AI. And further integration. So I don't think we're fully integrated with our security products. I think there's a lot more work to do to get that nice single pane of glass, everything together in one shot easily. I think we're getting pretty close to it, but I don't think we're quite there yet. All right, let's go into some operations and some rule tuning. All right, so first you want to start out with disabling categories of alerts, because if I have a Windows environment, maybe I don't care about Linux and vice versa. So just disable full categories. And then you start looking at your false positive hits, and you can start disabling those based on either IP, signature, or both. IDS, IPS. IDS obviously tap spam port scenario. You want to start with a lot of rules and then trim them down. If you're doing IPS, start with only a handful of select rules and then add to them. And the reason is, if you add a rule, you want to start small, because if a rule does end up blocking legitimate traffic, you want to be able to catch it, versus if you add a whole bunch, then you may not know which rule is blocking what traffic. And you can do a testing bake-off. The way you could do it is clone a production system and ensure that IDS and IPS is configured to monitor that. Request red team pen testers to hit those boxes and see what kind of alerts you get. And if you don't get alerts, you can perform a packet capture and figure out what's the deal. Usually it's encrypted. Speaking of PCAPs, you'll need scalable storage if you want to store them. It's kind of a decision you're going to have to make if I do just logs or if I do logs and PCAPs. There's advantages, disadvantages to both. Some things to consider: if you do a disk array, it's nice for short-term storage, but for long-term storage, consider something like an S3 storage bucket, something like that. I like the hybrid approach because I have access to recent logs, but I also retain my logs for long-term storage. You'll hear this called hot, warm, and cold storage as well. All right, Tls inspection, pretty much got to decide, do I maintain privacy, or do I want to inspect all traffic? And I've kind of thought about this as, do I have BYOD, or do I have only company-owned assets? If you have a mix, try to segment them with network segments so you can monitor them independently. For only things like servers or corporate-owned assets, I would consider highly SSL TLS inspection. For BYOD type stuff, due to legal privacy issues, I would probably not. And that's something everyone's got to make themselves. And so from experience, So another meme, this is probably my favorite. This is a experience. This is not a lesson. This is from experience. So event hooks and automation. Deployment scripts or script to scripts. Simple bash script, you can do a lot. What kind of infrastructure do you have? Salt, Ansible, Chef, Puppet, your SDDC. A lot of vendors are embracing infrastructure deployment systems. Deployment via bash is probably through an API, and on the back end of infrastructure deployment systems is also the API. It's just wrapped in different rules. Backups and version control. We've already talked about that, but you can do things like scripted API calls. You could do scripted backups, either a pull or a push. And you can also integrate with your enterprise solution if you have an enterprise backup. Operations, something that LBL guys did pretty well is for their SSH flows, they really don't care about the data payload, they just care about the control traffic. So as soon as there's an SSH connection made, I think it's Bro, yeah, Justin created a script that it would just capture the control packets, and it would actually drop the data, but the data packets. So you're not capturing encrypted traffic, you're just capturing session information. Tool integration is also pretty critical. Logging, this is integration. This is kind of a basic log setup. I think everyone here is going to be somewhat familiar with this. Question you might ask is why an intermediary syslog server? We've had a few incidents where going through the SIM was kind of painstaking. We knew there was information in either the PCAP or the IDS log. So we just went to the syslog server, ran a couple of commands, grep, cut, whatever, and found what we needed to. Another fun command is zgrep. So if you don't want to have to unzip your file, you can just use zgrep. And for another alternative, consider Apache Kafka. It's an open source log forwarding tool. It queues up logs in case your log server dies, stuff like that. So a couple of tools just to kind of help parse through snort logs. There's actually another tool that was presented earlier today called CyberChef, and it's included in Security Onion. And so check out Jonathan Glass's talk that he gave earlier on CyberChef, because you can leverage that as well. And I think someone in this talk mentioned they were concerned about running their queries against the hosted CyberChef site. So if you're concerned with that, you've already got it. Security Onion, you're good to go. You can just run it against the one on Security Onion. What I like to do is I like to have my analyst install Security Onion on their workstation and use it as an analyst tool as well, not just an IDS IPS system. All right, what do I log? Network IDS and IPS alerts, obviously. Files, I want to see all files coming in and out of my network. HTTP traffic, I want to see on the wire. I want to see DNS. You can check out Jeff Cummings' presentation yesterday on why you want to see DNS and DHCP traffic. All right, so network security monitoring. Is anyone here in the cloud? Anyone moved to the cloud? Okay. Yeah, so it's picking up the speed at which organizations are either moving fully to the cloud or doing a hybrid approach, or multi-cloud is a new thing. It's picking up pretty quick. Some things to consider: are you a IaaS, PaaS, or a SaaS customer? So basically, no matter what, you have two options. You can bring your traffic logs and alerts all back, or you can just do NSM in the cloud, and maybe you want to just selectively take interesting things back to your own network. So here's kind of another diagram that I'm not going to go over because I want to get through this, but please check it out when you guys get some time. All right, so infrastructure as a service is kind of like a DIY. Platform as a service is kind of in that middle gray area. And when you do software as a service, you really don't have much visibility. You might get app logs, but you're not going to get things like OS logs in software as a service. However, there's now the cloud managed security service providers that can help out with things like visibility and doing NSM in the cloud. Yep. So in summary, vendor solution versus open source solution, not just about money. How do you gain visibility? TAPs versus spans. Can do VLAN routing, virtual wires. your appliance gateway, which is applicable to the cloud. Software-defined data center, feature architecture, went over some rule tuning, test QA, logging, PCAPs, event hooks, APIs, and again, scope and coverage, courtesy of Dan Holden. Thank you, everyone.